In the dim light of the early evening, shadows stretched across the living room, playing hide and seek with the remnants of a life once cherished. There, amidst the quiet, sat Julia, her gaze lost in the flickering flames of the fireplace. The fire's warmth did little to thaw the coldness inside her, a coldness born from choices made in a path irrevocably taken. "I was happy once," she whispered to the empty room, her voice a mere echo of a life filled with laughter and love. Her fingers toyed with the wedding band she still wore, a symbol of a promise now shattered, yet she couldn't bring herself to remove it. It was her penance, her reminder of what had been and what she had lost. Julia's mind wandered back to the days when she first met Michael, her husband. He was a man of gentle strength, with eyes that sparkled with kindness and a smile that could light up the darkest room. They had met in college, two young souls with dreams as big as the sky. Love had come easily, like a summer breeze, and with it came the promise of a future filled with hope and happiness. Their wedding day was a blur of joy and laughter, a perfect start to their journey together. Michael had looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world, his vows spoken with a sincerity that touched her very soul. They had danced under the stars, lost in their own little universe, believing that nothing could ever come between them. But as the years passed, the extraordinary became ordinary. The conversations grew shorter, the laughter less frequent. Julia found herself lost in the mundanity of everyday life, the spark that once ignited her heart slowly dimming. That was when he entered her life, the other man, David. David was everything Michael wasn't: spontaneous, adventurous, and exciting. He made her feel alive in ways she hadn't in years. It started innocently enough, a shared smile, a lingering glance, but soon, they were drawn to each other with an intensity that frightened her. She knew it was wrong, knew she was betraying the man who had given her nothing but love and loyalty, yet she couldn't pull herself away. The affair was like a fire, consuming everything in its path. Julia was caught in the flames, unable to escape, unwilling to try. She told herself it was just a fling, that it meant nothing, but deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. She was tearing her own world apart, piece by piece. Then came the day Michael found out. The look in his eyes, a mix of hurt, disbelief, and betrayal, was a dagger to her heart. She had expected anger, fury, even hatred, but the quiet resignation in his voice as he asked her why was worse than any of those. She had no answer, no excuse that could justify the pain she had caused. The divorce was a quiet affair, devoid of the drama that had led to it. Michael was fair, more than fair, but with his kindness came the crushing weight of guilt. Julia watched as he walked away from her, from their life together, taking with him the last remnants of the love they had shared. Now, as she sat alone in the house they once called home, Julia realized the true cost of her actions. She had sought excitement, a temporary escape from reality, but in doing so, she had lost everything that truly mattered. The lover who had seemed so essential to her happiness had long since vanished, leaving her with nothing but memories and regret. Tears slicked down her cheeks, unbidden yet cathartic. She mourned not just for what she had lost, but for the woman she had been, the woman who believed in love, in fidelity, in the promises made under a starlit sky. That woman was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized, someone scarred by choices and haunted by echoes of regret. In the flickering light of the fire, Julia made a silent vow. She would find a way to atone for her mistakes, to rebuild her life from the ashes of her past. It would not be easy, and the journey would be fraught with reminders of what she had done, but she owed it to the memory of what she and Michael once had. She stood up, her movements slow, weighted down by the heaviness in her heart. The wedding band on her finger glinted in the firelight, a symbol of a past she could never return to, but also a reminder of the lessons learned. With a deep breath, she turned away from the fire, ready to face the uncertain path ahead. Julia's mind, often a whirlpool of regret, sometimes found solace in the memories of her past, a past painted in the hues of love and innocence. As she sat in the silence of her now too large living room, her thoughts drifted back to those early days with Michael, days filled with promise and hope. They had been young, fresh out of college, with dreams that stretched beyond the horizon. Michael, with his unwavering optimism, was a beacon of light in Julia's life. He had a way of making the mundane magical, of turning everyday moments into memories. She recalled their small, cozy apartment, the laughter that echoed off its walls, the plans they made tucked under blankets, dreaming of a future together. Their love was a living thing, growing and evolving with each passing day. Michael had a way of listening that made Julia feel like she was the most important person in the world. He celebrated her successes and held her through her failures. She felt seen, understood, and cherished. They married on a warm summer evening, under a canopy of stars. Julia remembered walking down the aisle, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes locked on Michael's. He stood there, a picture of calm uncertainty, his love an anchor in the sea of her anxieties. When they said their vows, she believed them with every fiber of her being. They were a team, unbreakable in their unity. The first few years of marriage were a blissful blur. They traveled when they could, exploring new places, making memories in every corner of the world. Julia loved these adventures, but she found equal joy in the quiet nights at home, cooking together or watching movies, Michael's arm around her, her head on his shoulder. Life seemed perfect, but as the novelty of marriage wore off, the routine set in. Michael's job as an engineer demanded more of his time, and Julia, busy with her career in marketing, found herself alone more often than not. The conversations that once flowed effortlessly became functional, limited to the necessities of daily living. It was during one of these quiet periods that Julia met David. He was a consultant hired by her company for a short-term project. David was like a gust of wind, unsettling the calm waters of Julia's life. He was everything that Michael, in his steady reliability, was not. David was spontaneous, bold, and his energy was infectious. Their initial interactions were strictly professional, but there was an undercurrent of something more, a spark that threatened to ignite. Julia found herself drawn to David's charisma, his ability to make her laugh, to make her feel exciting and vibrant. She began to look forward to their meetings, the brief coffee breaks, the accidental brushes of hands. As Julia reminisced, she realized that the seeds of her betrayal were sown not in the moments of passion that followed but in these seemingly innocent interactions. She had allowed herself to drift away from Michael, emotionally long before the physical affair began. The realization stung, a bitter reminder of the gradual erosion of the vows she once held sacred. The affair with David started as an emotional connection, a shared understanding that seemed to fill the void Julia felt in her life. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations a mix of playful banter and deep, introspective discussions. Julia felt alive, a sensation she hadn't realized she had been missing. But with every stolen moment, every secret meeting, Julia felt a growing sense of unease. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, yet the thrill of the forbidden was intoxicating. She convinced herself it was harmless, that no one would get hurt, that she could keep her two worlds separate. However, as the affair turned physical, the gravity of her actions began to weigh on her. Guilt gnawed at her, a constant companion in her moments of solitude. She saw the signs of her neglect in Michael's eyes, the unasked questions, the slight dimming of the light that once shone so brightly for her. Julia's heart ached as she remembered the love she and Michael had shared, a love that had been pure and true. She had taken it for granted, blinded by the allure of something new and exciting. The realization that she had sacrificed something so precious for a fleeting passion filled her with a sorrow that was almost too much to bear. In her heart, Julia knew she had reached a crossroads. One path led back to Michael, to an attempt to salvage the life they had built together. The other continued down the treacherous road she had chosen, a road that promised excitement but led to an unknown destination. But choice, as Julia would soon learn, was a luxury she no longer had. The decision would be made for her, and the consequences would be more devastating than she could have ever imagined. As autumn crept in, bringing with it a chill that seeped into the bones, Julia found herself at a crossroads. The affair with David, once a thrilling escape, had evolved into a complex web of lies and deceit. Each secret rendezvous, each whispered promise under the cover of night, pulled her further away from the woman she once was, from the life she had built with Michael. David was like a storm, wild and unpredictable. He had a way of making Julia feel desired, a sensation she hadn't realized she was missing. Their conversations, once light and playful, had deepened into discussions of future possibilities. He spoke of a life together, free from the constraints of societal expectations. It was a seductive vision, one that played into Julia's growing sense of dissatisfaction. But with every stolen moment, Julia's guilt grew. She saw the signs of her betrayal reflected in Michael's eyes. He had always been attentive, but there was now a hint of distance in his affection, a subtle change that gnawed at Julia's conscience. The emotional affair had turned physical one late evening, in David's sleek downtown apartment. The night was filled with passion, a burning intensity that left Julia both exhilarated and hollow. As she lay in David's arms, a sense of dread settled over her. What had she done? The reality of her actions hit her like a wave, leaving her gasping for air. In the days that followed, Julia walked through her life like a ghost, her thoughts consumed by the affair. She and David continued to meet, each encounter a mix of passion and despair. Julia knew she was living a lie, yet the thought of ending things with David filled her with an inexplicable fear. He had become her addiction, her escape from the reality of a failing marriage. Michael, in his quiet way, began to change. He worked longer hours, his conversations with Julia brief and distracted. The comfortable silence they once shared was now a chasm of unspoken words. Julia wondered if he knew, if he sensed the betrayal that hung in the air like a heavy fog. The affair reached a turning point one rainy night. David had called, his voice urgent, asking her to meet him. Julia, torn between guilt and desire, agreed. They met at a secluded spot, the city lights a distant glow. David spoke of a future, of leaving everything behind and starting anew. It was a fantasy, a beautiful, impossible dream. But as David spoke, Julia's thoughts drifted to Michael. She remembered the man who had stood by her through the best and worst of times. He was her rock, her steady anchor in a turbulent sea. What was she doing, risking everything for a fleeting passion? The drive home was a blur, the rain a mirror to her turmoil. She arrived home to find Michael waiting, a look of concern on his face. He had been worried, he said, about her late nights, her distracted demeanor. Julia's heart broke at the worry in his voice, the love that still lingered there despite her betrayal. That night, as she lay in bed beside Michael, Julia made a decision. She would end things with David. It would be hard, but she owed it to Michael, to their marriage. She had to try to salvage the love they once had, even if it meant walking away from the excitement and intensity that David offered. The next day, Julia met David, her resolve firm. She explained that she couldn't continue down this path, that she needed to focus on her marriage. David's reaction was one of hurt and anger. He accused her of playing with his emotions, of leading him on. The words stung, but Julia stood her ground. As she walked away from David, a sense of relief washed over her. It was short-lived, however. The reality of what she had done, the lies she had told, the trust she had broken, it all came crashing down on her. The path to redemption would be long and fraught with pain. But Julia was determined. She would face the consequences of her actions. She would try to rebuild the trust she had shattered. It was a vow she made to herself, a vow she hoped was not too late. In the wake of her decision to end the affair with David, Julia's life became a study in contrasts. By day, she was a woman attempting to mend the frayed edges of her marriage, while by night, she was haunted by dreams of what she had given up, a passionate, albeit illusory, escape with David. Despite her resolve, Julia found herself struggling to bridge the gap that had formed between her and Michael. Their interactions, once filled with warmth and affection, now felt strained, the conversations stilted. She longed to confess, to pour out her guilt and seek forgiveness, but fear held her back. The fear of hurting Michael even more, of seeing the love in his eyes turn to disgust. Michael, for his part, seemed to sense the change in her. He made efforts to reconnect, suggesting dinners out and weekend getaways, but Julia's guilt cast a shadow over these overtures. She participated, but her heart wasn't in it. The memory of her betrayal, like a dark cloud, loomed over every moment they shared. Meanwhile, David was not content to let go. He sent messages, oscillating between pleading and anger, each word a needle pricking at the edges of her resolve. Julia ignored them, but the temptation to respond, to seek comfort in the familiarity of his affection, was a constant battle. As autumn gave way to the cold embrace of winter, Julia's world began to unravel. A chance encounter brought everything crashing down. One evening, while out with Michael, they ran into David. The meeting was accidental, a cruel twist of fate, but the consequences were immediate and devastating. David, perhaps in a moment of hurt or spite, revealed the affair. The words spilled out, harsh and unyielding, leaving a silence that was deafening. Julia watched, her heart breaking, as the color drained from Michael's face. His eyes, once filled with warmth, turned cold, a mirror of icy chill that had descended upon them. The ride home was a nightmare. Michael, his usual calm demeanor shattered, demanded the truth. Julia, her defenses crumbling, confessed. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling lost, but even as she explained, she knew there were no excuses for her actions. Her words, meant to heal, only seemed to widen the gap between them. In the days that followed, their home became a battleground of emotions. There were tears, accusations, and long periods of suffocating silence. Julia tried to apologize, to make amends, but the hurt she had caused was too deep, the betrayal too profound. Michael, once the embodiment of understanding and forgiveness, was now a stranger, his gaze distant, his words sharp and cutting. Julia realized that in seeking something she thought was missing, she had lost everything that truly mattered. The climax of their conflict came on a cold, winter night. In a moment of raw emotion, Michael confessed his own pain, his sense of failure in not being enough for her. Julia's heart shattered at his words. She had never meant to hurt him, had never stopped loving him, but her actions had spoken louder than any words could. In the end, Michael made the decision that Julia had been too cowardly to make. He asked for a divorce, his voice void of the warmth that had once defined him. Julia knew she had no right to argue, no standing to ask for another chance. She had broken the most sacred of vows, and now she had to face the consequences. The divorce proceedings were a blur, a series of meetings and signatures that dissolved the life they had built together. Julia moved out, leaving behind not just a home but a part of herself. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time in years. As she settled into her new, smaller apartment, the reality of her situation hit her. She had sought happiness in the arms of another, only to find herself lost in a labyrinth of guilt and regret. She had sacrificed a love that was real for a fantasy that had turned to ash in her hands. Julia's days became a routine of work and solitude. The friends they had shared sided with Michael, leaving her to navigate the aftermath of her decisions alone. She found no joy in her work, no peace in her solitude. The bed was too big, the nights too long, and her thoughts too heavy with the weight of what she had lost. In her moments of deepest despair, Julia realized the extent of her folly. She had been chasing a mirage, blinded by the allure of something new and exciting. In doing so, she had thrown away the one thing that had been her constant, her safe harbor in the stormy seas of life. But regret, she knew, was a poor companion. It offered no solace, no redemption. Julia understood that she had to find a way to move forward, to learn from her mistakes and rebuild her life. It was a daunting task, one that seemed insurmountable in the shadow of her shattered past. In the wake of the divorce, Julia's life felt like a ship adrift, caught in a storm with no land in sight. The once vibrant world she knew had turned gray, each day blending into the next with a monotonous rhythm that echoed her inner void. She tried to reach out to David in those early days of isolation, seeking a lifeline in the chaos that her life had become. But David, perhaps sensing the irreversible change in her circumstances, had moved on. His silence was a stark reminder of the transient nature of their affair, a painful lesson in the folly of building castles on sand. The loneliness was suffocating. Julia had lost more than her husband in the aftermath of her betrayal. Friends, once a constant presence in her life, had distanced themselves, siding with Michael in unspoken judgment. Her social circle, once vibrant and active, had evaporated, leaving her to face the long nights alone. Work became her only refuge, a place where she could lose herself in tasks and deadlines. But even there, the whispers followed her, colleagues casting sidelong glances, their curiosity a thinly veiled mask over their disapproval. The respect and camaraderie she once enjoyed had faded, replaced by a professional courtesy that was as cold as it was impersonal. Her family, though supportive, struggled to understand her choices. Her parents, married for over 40 years, were aghast at her actions. They offered love, but it was tinged with disappointment, a sentiment that Julia found harder to bear than outright anger. Her sister tried to be a confidant, but the gulf of judgment was too wide to bridge. Julia's evenings were spent in solitude, her apartment a stark reminder of the life she had lost. The walls, once filled with laughter and love, now stood silent, the emptiness a mirror of her heart. She found herself wandering through the rooms, touching objects that held memories of a past that was no longer hers. In her loneliness, Julia began to write. At first, it was a way to vent, to pour out her emotions onto the page. But as the days turned into weeks, it became a form of therapy. She wrote about her marriage, about the good times she had shared with Michael, the love that had been the foundation of their life together. She wrote about David, about the allure of the affair, and the illusion of happiness it had brought. She was brutally honest in her writing, not sparing herself the harsh truth of her actions. The words on the page were a mirror, reflecting the reality of the choices she had made. But it was in writing about the aftermath of her decisions that Julia found the deepest catharsis. She wrote about the pain, the guilt, and the profound sense of loss that had become her constant companions. The process was painful, but it was also illuminating. It forced her to confront the consequences of her actions, to face the woman she had become. As the seasons changed, so too did Julia. The initial shock and despair gave way to a somber acceptance. She had made mistakes, grievous ones, but she also realized that dwelling in the past would not change the present. She had to find a way to move forward, to rebuild her life from the ashes of her broken marriage. Julia started to take small steps towards healing. She joined a support group, finding solace in the stories of others who had traversed the rocky path of infidelity and divorce. She began to volunteer at a local charity, finding a sense of purpose in helping those less fortunate. The path to redemption was not easy. There were days when the weight of her guilt threatened to crush her, nights when the loneliness seemed insurmountable. But with each passing day, Julia found a little more strength, a little more clarity. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor, Julia realized something important. She had been seeking happiness in others, in Michael, in David, but true happiness had to come from within. She had to learn to love herself, to forgive herself, before she could hope to find peace. With this realization came a sense of liberation. Julia began to explore new interests, to rediscover parts of herself that she had long neglected. She took up painting, finding a creative outlet for her emotions. She started to write a blog, sharing her journey with who might be struggling with similar issues. Her relationship with her family slowly mended. Her parents, seeing her efforts to change, offered their unconditional support. Her sister became a confidant again, their conversations a mix of laughter and tears. As the months turned into a year, Julia found a new rhythm to her life. The pain of the past was still there, a scar that would never fully heal, but it no longer defined her. She had learned from her mistakes, grown from her experiences, and found a sense of self-worth that was not dependent on the approval of others. The journey was not over, Julia knew that. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and despair. But she also knew that she had the strength to face them, to continue moving forward. In the quiet of her apartment, Julia made a promise to herself. She would live her life with honesty and integrity. She would be kinder, not just to others, but to herself. And though she could not change the past, she could shape her future, one day at a time. In the aftermath of her personal storm, Julia found herself navigating a world that was both familiar and utterly alien. The remnants of her old life, like driftwood after a hurricane, were spattered around her, pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit together. The solitude that had once been oppressive began to offer a strange comfort. In the quiet of her apartment, Julia found time for introspection, a chance to delve into the depths of her soul and confront the truths she had long avoided. She reflected on her marriage with Michael, on the love that had been genuine and pure, and on how she had allowed herself to be swept away by a tide of selfish desire. As she pondered her past, Julia realized that her affair with David was not born out of love, but out of a need to fill a void within herself, a void created by her own insecurities and unmet expectations. David had been the distraction, an escape from the realities of her life, but he had not been the solution. The regret Julia felt was a constant ache, a reminder of the pain she had caused to the one person who had loved her unconditionally. She thought of Michael often, wondering how he was, whether he had found happiness. The thought of him moving on brought a bittersweet mix of relief and sorrow. The divorce had been a wake-up call, a harsh light shone on the parts of herself she had neglected.